All right. Welcome, everyone, to today's Sovryn Tea. Welcome to all of our guests and listeners from around the world. My name is Magnus, and I will be your host this evening. So today we're going to start off with learning about the respective projects of our guests, and next we will open up to a friendly debate on the future of Bitcoin scaling. And then we'll open up the floor for questions from listeners. So if anybody would like to ask questions to all our guests, just request to speak, and at the end we'll open it up and you can get a chance to ask any burning questions to all of our awesome guests today. So today we're going to be joined by Mr. John Carvalho. He's the CEO at Synonym and also the host of the Biz Bitcoin podcast. Mr. Matt Hill, the co-founder and CEO of Start9labs. Also, we have Mr. Yago, who is the early contributor to Sovryn Protocol and a bit of a Bitcoin OG. Also, John Light, who is a product contributor in the Sovryn community. So everyone, thank you very much for coming. I wanted to start everyone, could you just go in a bit, maybe present your project and what you hope it will achieve? John, would you like to start off, please?
Sure. The name of our company is Synonym, and basically we're trying to achieve this concept that we've created called the atomic economy, which is just trying to take the idea of hyper-Bitcoinization and combine it with, concepts to do with having a decentralized or self-sovereign web. And so we're trying to make a total alternative economy out of the web.
Very nice. And Matt, would you like to have the floor?
Yeah, thanks for having me. We're trying to build a new web so that John can build his economy on top of it. That's a bold statement, broad statement, and probably hyperbole, but we are seeking to democratize access to personal servers and therefore, allow for self-hosting, even for non-technical individuals, so that they can run self-hosted software and not have to depend on trusted third parties for their computing needs. So we are a computer company in the broadest sense, aiming to truly decentralize the whole concept of cloud computing so that it doesn't involve trusted third parties.
All right, well, look forward to learning a little more as we get further into this. Yago, would you like to do a little recap on Sovryn? What's going on?
Sure. Sovryn is a protocol working to pull together a bunch of different pieces of Bitcoin layer 2 technologies into a easy-to-use system for developers and users. So that includes sidechain technologies like Rootstock, Lightning Network, and the goal is to build a world on Bitcoin, an economy around Bitcoin. And right now the focus is primarily on decentralizing the ways people can use Bitcoin. So things like trading, lending, Bitcoin-backed stablecoins that can be supported by smart contracts are being and really have been developed and deployed by the Sovryn dev community.
Okay, and let's see here. So, and Light, would you like to have a little word yourself, just as the product contributor in the Sovryn community? Do you have anything to add there?
No, at least with regards to Sovryn, I think Yago gave a good summary, building a world on Bitcoin with a focus on financial applications right now. But just by way of introduction for myself, I have been in the Bitcoin community for many years now, and I actually co-founded a project called Bitseed, which was one of the first kind of plug-and-play Bitcoin nodes that was available on the market. So I can say I'm a big fan of Start9 and the different projects that are working on these personal servers and plug-and-play nodes. So yeah, I'm really excited to be on the call with you guys and John from Synonym.
Great. We also, just so you all know, we have 37 sats who just hopped on the call. Would you like to maybe introduce yourself and what you're doing over at Bitcoin Magazine?
What's up, y'all? CK from Bitcoin Magazine, definitely the least qualified person to be on this panel, but just covering all things Bitcoin, have strong opinions about Bitcoin scaling, so I will give my unqualified strong opinions here.
So to kick this off, just to see where, get this off with a bit of a friendly debate. There's lots of seems like there's overlap, but maybe some different contrast there. we were going to structure this around some friendly debate around the future of Bitcoin scaling. Yago, would you like to offer your thoughts on the subject to kick this off?
Oh wow, that's a big subject. So I could tackle this in a number of ways. Let me start by framing what I see as sort of my interest in this, which is I don't think it's inevitable that we achieve hyper-Bitcoinization. In fact, I think it would be the most unlikely outcome given everything we've seen with the rest of human history, right? Sound money is usually fought tooth and nail by elites. And so I think it's incredibly important, even for those of us who are perfectly happy just securing our own liberty, to be interested in the liberty and sovereignty of other people, because what is going to allow us to achieve hyper-Bitcoinization, to my mind, is two things. One is that we can drive mass adoption, and that means making it really, really easy for non-technical people to be free and to gain access to self-sovereignty. And the second thing is that we need to go beyond building just the money, because if we're building a money, that money needs to interact trustlessly with the world, and more importantly, that money only becomes money in the truest sense of the word if there's a powerful economy built around it. And so when I think of Bitcoin scaling, what I think about is how we can build layers around Bitcoin, which are going to allow us to build a economy around Bitcoin with as few intermediaries as possible, as few points of trust as possible, and that core to that is the idea that Bitcoin main chain itself is a set of rules that must be etched in stone, that must be effectively like a force of nature, unchanging. And so we can't do what practically every other project in the crypto space is doing, which is trying to rewrite the rules on an ongoing basis and pile everything into one chain. And so the best type of scaling is that scaling which we can do without making changes to Bitcoin main chain at all.
Okay, so we have a bit of a statement there. Does anyone agree, disagree? Is there any thoughts, opposition?
Sure, I'll give a similar overview that generally disagrees with some concepts there. Scaling, just in general, is the concept of being able to add more resources to a network in order to be able to scale that network to accommodate more usage. More usage can mean more users, can mean more transactions, more traffic, whatever, but it all is related to that network, one network. And so, for example, adding a network is not necessarily scaling unless that network is actually facilitating things within the original network, like the Lightning Network, for example. The Lightning Network is made out of Bitcoin transactions. Not every Bitcoin transaction that it creates hits the blockchain, but this is an efficiency. Basically, it scales the quantity of transactions by making a large set of them ephemeral and unnecessary. And so thus, Lightning is a scaling layer for the Bitcoin network. And somehow they found a way to create an additional network that supplements Bitcoin to scale. Now, blockchains in general, they just do not scale by design. They're maximally redundant. And so anything that happens on the base layer is essentially a form of optimization. This is the only type of scaling you can get without a trade-off. It's just you optimize. Like you can, make it take less information to create a transaction. You do things like SegWit and Taproot where you can start embedding things and, adding a form of optimization there. And in contrast, something like a sidechain, for example, actually competes with Bitcoin for transactions because it is a separate network. It does not actually use Bitcoin transactions itself in order to operate, and it does not offload any of the resources in a way that is actually deterministically going back into Bitcoin. It is a separate network that requires a trusted input peg in or peg out aspect usually. And so it actually competes with Bitcoin. Any transaction that happens in a sidechain is one that will not happen on Bitcoin. And it doesn't ever go back to it. In other words, you have to actually make some sort of trade or peg out or trusted process to go from one network to the other. And so in that sense, I think that if we feel like we can scale any blockchain in some way, we have to figure out how to do it with one first. And so while you may see, quote unquote, success of altcoins, sidechains, shitcoins, DeFis, NFTs, et cetera, their success is not measured in the same way as the success of scaling a blockchain. It's measured in success of their narrative for the most part, or success in giving people opportunities to gamble or kind of cheat their way into, making money faster. And so we have to be careful about how we measure success. We have to be careful about how we define scaling, and we have to be really careful about whether or not we're actually competing with Bitcoin or helping it.
Well, gosh, looks like we're off to some friendly debate already. Is there anything you would like to say to that in contrast, in agreement, or to John's points?
I'll let someone else respond first. I have things to say, but
so I guess I have a quick question. John, in my mind, I kind of differentiate, like there's obviously scaling of trustless Bitcoin transactions. That's one bucket, which I think like you're trying to make that distinction of like in order to actually scale a blockchain, that's what you actually have to do is trustlessly scale trustlessly scale Bitcoin. But on the flip side, I see pretty much every monetary network that could have a Bitcoin denomination as a way to scale Bitcoin, the monetary unit. And I know that may or may not require some level of trust. Maybe in your definition, it takes transactions away from the Bitcoin blockchain itself. But I do see that in like some sort of, I guess, more broader definition of scaling as a way to scale the money that is Bitcoin. What do you think of that?
So you can't have a more broader definition of scaling. It has a literal definition. It means to add resources to a network in order to increase the capacity of that network in some way. And so if you aren't doing that, you aren't scaling that thing. So you have to be, distinctive about what you're talking about scaling. Are you scaling the quantity of people that touch a blockchain? In other words, are you trying to be abstract about it? Or are you scaling the quantity of people that are not using money and now using cryptocurrencies instead? Like, you have to be careful. Like, what are we actually talking about here?
I guess my one distinction is that Bitcoin as a 21 million units to measure value is almost like a mental operating system. So theoretically, you could scale, even if it's not directly in a trustless way, you could scale that monetary operating system.
So you mean basically adopting the asset itself as backing things in the world. Well, if that's your standard, you have to include altcoins. You have to say that wrapped Bitcoin is scaling of Bitcoin as a monetary asset, right? Does that fit you? Fit your definition?
I mean, I would say that that's my unqualified strong opinion, would be that Bitcoin scales in ways that may or may not follow our best practices.
Yeah, I personally don't consider that to be scaling because you're not actually increasing the capacity of the Bitcoin network in any way. And so I think that you could argue that this may increase your bags and the value of your bags. You know what I mean? That, in other words, if Bitcoin has so much utility that people are willing to use it in a trusted way, then it's that desirable of an asset. And so thus it is kind of growing, but that's not scaling in my opinion. That's some sort of, other word that you could use. It's being adopted, it's being trusted. So you can trust Bitcoin, you can trust other networks to hold Bitcoin for you, but I don't consider custody to be a form of scaling. I consider it to be, we could always do that. We could always trust people with our assets.
Sure, but so I think there's a couple of things here, and I'd be interested to clarify them. So one is the question, and I think 37 Sets has raised this, what are we defining as Bitcoin? And more specifically, John, what are you defining as the Bitcoin network, right? So the blockchain itself is not really a network, but potentially the collection of nodes that hold the blockchain is a network. The users of Bitcoin are a network, a social network. effectively you have the monetary network, which is the ways in which the network is being used. So how are you defining the network, I think, is one question that rises from this.
The network is defined by the protocol within my node. Everything else is extra.
Sure. Okay. But then Lightning Network, right, even by its very name, is described as a separate network, right? I could be running Bitcoin.
Correct. And
without
in many ways, Lightning Network does compete with Bitcoin. It does pull transactions off of the Bitcoin network. So there is a trade-off, mostly to miners, where the fees they may have collected if the blocks were more full or over full in fee rates, they now don't have access to that because there are transactions being offloaded to Lightning Network. But all scaling is a form of debasement in some way. There's a trade-off. And you have to realize that scaling. Otherwise, you're actually just devaluing the current users by making them require more resources to do the same amount of activity. And so when you add scaling to Bitcoin in some way, which is you add resources or overhead to Bitcoin essentially, you have to actually realize that scaling with either additional transactions or additional users. And if you don't do that, you're actually just adding weight to the chain, not scaling it.
Okay, so I think we're talking, I mean, certainly there's several strategies here around scaling and what you're trying to scale, right? And if I understand correctly, what you're describing as competing with Bitcoin is this idea that if we can allow transactions to occur more cheaply on sort of whatever we would define as a layer 2, then that is competing with the scarcity of the layer 1 transaction value. Is that the competition you're referring to?
Pretty much. I mean, while blocks are not full, then we are not realizing all forms of scaling. And so you have to have blocks in an entirely full state to be operating at full potential. And if Lightning Network is one of the reasons why the SegWit block isn't fully full, then we can't actually dissect this, right? There's no way to measure who or why people did what, in these networks. But just, theoretically, and speaking about the fundamental, primitives here, that would be true. That the difference that Lightning has is that it is actually dependent on the Bitcoin network, and it is made out of Bitcoin transactions themselves. And so while you could say that less transactions happen on the Bitcoin network, you still need a minimum value of transactions. In other words, you have to be willing to do like 3 or more transactions within Lightning to be able to make up for that. You just could have done it on chain in the first place.
Right. So, for example, Sovryn, a lot of Sovryn is built on Rootstock, which is a Bitcoin sidechain, which has 2 interesting properties, right? One is the base asset is pegged Bitcoin, which means that you can't get any asset onto Bitcoin without a Bitcoin transaction from main chain, and also you're returning to main chain. So in that respect, it's similar to Lightning Network. The other interesting aspect of it is it's merge mined with a goal to eventually being blind merge mined, but merge mined with Bitcoin. So every single transaction that occurs on Rootstock is paying a fee to the Bitcoin miners and increasing the security budget of Bitcoin as a whole. In this respect, it's actually unlike Lightning Network, and to the extent that you define that as competition to Bitcoin, I would say that Rootstock is less competitive than Lightning Network as a method of scaling. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Well, I would disagree. I would say that Sovryn Network is 100% competitive because it is not a Bitcoin sidechain. There's no such thing as a Bitcoin sidechain. Like a Bitcoin sidechain doesn't mean anything. It was originally, the design was that you would be able to do a deterministic peg in and peg out that was not trusted. And that design ended up not being possible. And so the federated sidechain was invented, and now we have proposals for other types, et cetera, and yours is merge mined, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But there's no such thing as an actual Bitcoin sidechain. The difference between Risk and other, quote unquote, liquid and other Bitcoin sidechains, and in wrapped Bitcoin and Ethereum, there is no difference. It's a trusted, permissioned process to enter a private network that had basically each of these networks has different governance processes baked into the network to replace miners. And that's all they do is they say, we have a blockchain, and our design for our blockchain is that instead of having mining, we replace them with a federation or some other mechanism, and then we try to take advantage of some qualities of Bitcoin to make this sort of enforced, by using op return information or whatever methods each one uses. But ultimately, it does not have any actually atomic connection to Bitcoin. It is a trusted process, so that means it is an entirely separate network and not scaling whatsoever. So every transaction that happens within a sidechain is one that will never happen in Bitcoin. Whereas Lightning, every transaction that happens in Lightning, literally they are Bitcoin transactions. And every single one of them could be submitted to the main chain at any moment. It's just a matter of that people decide to wait and trust each other mutually, and to wait, and because there is an enforcement mechanism in place within that network protocol.
Okay, so I quite clearly disagree with most of everything you said. So I think, first of all, it's clearly the case that first of all, the transactions are very tied to Bitcoin. They're utilizing the asset. They're not wrapped in the same way that wrapped Bitcoin.
They're not utilizing the asset. You sold the asset to buy those tokens.
No, you don't sell your asset at all.
That's literally what you do. You have to send your Bitcoin. Isn't that how risk works? Like, you have to send your Bitcoin to receive RBTC, and you have to send it to a specific entity or address within the network that you're expecting to behave a certain way, but you don't have any actual way to enforce that behavior. You just hope that it will behave the way you expect in that initial transaction, and then you receive a new asset called RBTC. And the exchange rate for that asset is 99% or so of the Bitcoin amount, right?
No. So I think this is a question of semantics here, right? I think your choice of words frequently is
literal.
To my mind, misleading, right? So, for example, this idea that scaling is a form of competition. I think that's an oxymoronic definition of scaling.
I didn't say that. I didn't say scaling is a form of competition. I said that sidechains are not scaling.
No, but you argued that anything which removes transactions from Bitcoin main chain is effectively competing with Bitcoin, which would imply that any form of scaling is a form of competition with Bitcoin. But putting that aside, right, I certainly don't agree that when you lock Bitcoin up in a multi-sig that you have sold your Bitcoin in any way, shape, or form. I certainly don't agree that rootstock is a federated or permissioned chain. I definitely disagree that there isn't an atomic connection between the two networks, because they're using the same asset, and every single transaction is paid for in Bitcoin to Bitcoin miners, helping to add to Bitcoin's security budget. So I think
we also didn't talk about merge mining, which merge mining is also a distortion of Bitcoin network incentives. Basically, you're trying to subsidize miners to do their work also for your chain, but the difficulty is always going to be higher than you. So it's just free money, and they're just going to sell that. So it's like there's no reason to even be doing it in the first place.
Okay, so I think the approach that you're the argument that you're making, right, which is that merge mining, right, is a form of competition, and the Lightning Network is a form of competition, and I think I understand where you're coming from with these views, but I think that they are a poor description of what is actually happening. They don't take into account that indeed you are improving, like, for example, like very clear things, right? The ability to improve the security budget of Bitcoin is a huge improvement. The ability to add additional functionality to Bitcoin is a huge improvement if we don't want to make changes to main chain.
You're not improving the security budget. Like, all you're doing is giving miners free money, and you're basically a beggar on the side of the road saying, hey, can you throw some proof of work at me so I can pretend to be like Bitcoin?
If a Bitcoin miner receives additional funds for performing the act of performing the SHA-256 hash, right? That is used by Bitcoin, and they get more money for it, then they have a larger budget with which to perform that act. But I think we're getting into a little like corner bits here, right? Because I think your overall argument can be summed up as anything which changes the activity that people are performing with Bitcoin is changing the incentive structures or the behaviors around Bitcoin. And I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true. And I think it is a problem, right? Because on the one hand, we have a system which we want to see grow, a system where we want to be able to do many, many things with. We want to reach hyper-Bitcoinization. But on the other hand, we also want the system to be as unchanging, as much a law of nature as possible. And so there is a central dilemma of how we can maintain Bitcoin as a rule set. And I think fundamentally that is the most important thing about Bitcoin, is it's a set of fundamental rules, right? Not change those while being able to continue to build and advance Bitcoin to the extent that it's a technology, which I think is very much a secondary aspect. And so I think if we want to do that, the key thing that we need to figure out are what are the core rules that we can never sacrifice, never change, and around which we must galvanize. And if we don't have a very clear sense of what those rules are, then it starts to become the case that anything could potentially be a sacrilegious or forbidden change, which means that we can't do anything.
Well, first of all, we can't ever really know how everybody defines and what trade-offs they're willing to make in order to scale Bitcoin or even indirectly scale Bitcoin. Obviously, there are many, many people that are okay with not using Bitcoin at all and using alternatives. And so in some ways, we could try to take responsibility for that and say, why isn't that all happening on Bitcoin, and be jealous? But in the end, like, the rules of Bitcoin were set in the Genesis block, and all we can do is add more rules. We can't change the rules. There's no such thing as a hard fork, and so we can't change the rules. All we can do is find creative ways to add overhead to the protocol with new rules. And so every time that we add new rules that add some sort of form of scaling, we have to recognize that there's a trade-off where we have now added overhead to the cost of running a node or the ability to mine, or some player for every design is going to have to pay some overhead costs to participate to realize that scale. And if we don't realize the scale that has been added with new users, new transactions, whatever, more capacity in the abstract, then we're all paying the price of an increased scale without, increased usage. And so we have to be very careful about when we scale, how we scale, and what choices we make. And so another thing I'll mention is, we haven't brought up yet, is that raw scaling, in ways that don't require a hard fork is still an option, and it is, in my opinion, potentially a better option than some of the things we have been considering. I would rather, for example, monitor the progress of computers and hard drive storage and bandwidth and the costs of these things throughout the world, and make an assessment and say, hey, we can have the block size be a little bit bigger now, and we can do this through, hijinks like the SegWit block, and let's do that again. We can reweight things again without doing a hard fork. Those things, if the world can accommodate them, if technology has increased in pace, those things are actually much safer to do than things like trusting a federation or trusting that some merge mine chain will still be there when I want to take my Bitcoin out. Like these you don't have to do those things. Like, if you actually want to scale Bitcoin. And yeah. I'll go one further and say you certainly don't need another blockchain to scale a blockchain. Like this idea to me is like absurd. Blockchains are literally designed to not scale, so there's no world where adding a blockchain on top somehow makes blockchain scale better, and especially if that blockchain now has a competing native asset, whether it be RBTC, SOV, or WBTC or ETH. All of these things are competing assets, and they compete with the aspect that CK was mentioning, which is Bitcoin as a form of store of value for the world. And so like all of these things are just so competitive to me, and I can't even imagine why people accept them as calling them scaling layers of Bitcoin.
So I agree with pretty much everything you just said. And
case closed.
and I'll point out at the end the one thing I think I disagree with, but I think this idea that you have, right, which is that we need to be extremely careful about how we're scaling, and that potentially, just increasing the size, this has become something of a sacrilegious thing to say, but just increasing the block size might be one of the best ways to scale, right? While I don't think we should increase the block size, I think you're right, and you make a very succinct. It's a strong example, right? An exemplar of the fact that the size of the block is actually not one of those core rules that like the 21 million cap, the permissionless transactions, right? Those are core rules. The size of the block, even looking at the thoughts of the developers early on, and particularly Satoshi, was clearly never considered a core rule. And I also agree with what you were saying, that we can never know what the core rules are. But what we do know is that any change that we introduce is going to introduce some overhead for someone, right? So then the question becomes, how can we reduce the overhead that we are adding as much as possible? And how can we make as few changes as possible to Bitcoin Core, to Bitcoin main chain? And I think if we continue,
I want to make sure you don't make the leap from reducing as much as possible, which is like being responsible about how you do it, to not doing it at all and doing it elsewhere. That's the difference here.
Well, so let's examine that for a second, right? So you say that adding an additional blockchain doesn't make sense, and to a great extent I agree with you. In fact, I think that at least in the roadmap that I would have ideally in my head for Bitcoin, we would get to a place where we don't have additional blockchains. Certainly, not as sidechain. I think if you look at what has been developed using zero-knowledge proofs, right? The idea of rollups, and in particular zero-knowledge rollups, which is the idea that you can have a large number of transactions aggregated into zero-knowledge proofs and only have the proof introduced into the chain, is a very, very powerful idea, because it takes a large sum of transactions, reduces them into an aggregate, hashes them, and you put that trustlessly into the single blockchain. And what you have on the other side could be anything from a massive AWS machine to a blockchain. It doesn't really matter, and it doesn't impact the chain that you're aggregating to at all.
How is that any different than what Lightning is already doing? Like Lightning is already taking many, many transactions and compressing them into one final transaction for settlement.
Yeah, Yago, I have a question. I'd be curious to hear what some of the other folks on the panel think about this.
Sure, absolutely. So let me just finish my thought and answer John's question. The reason it's different is because of its flexibility. State channels are a very complicated and inflexible structure, and I think that's been one of the reasons that Lightning Network hasn't seen as quick adoption as we would have liked. With a zero-knowledge proof system, you're able to do basically anything. And the bottom line for me is that I don't.
Yeah, but you're leaving out the trade-offs, right? Like there's overhead to creating these transactions. There's a certain game in theory applied to how you implement the roll-ups, and I don't remember the details, but however you're validating these things, it's not foolproof. It's not like a magic thing where now we can just scale and put a bunch of transactions inside a hash and it's done. There's actually complications to how it works, and there's trade-offs to how it works.
Yes, there are trade-offs, but the trade-offs are minimized. And we can talk about them in a bit, but I agree that we should definitely let some of the other participants on the panel voice some of their thoughts around this topic.
Sure, I saw CK, he was raising his hand. Would you like to chime in?
No, I was just trying to give the other guys a chance.
Ah, gotcha. Okay, so gentlemen from Start9labs, there's been quite a bit of debate back and forth. Do you guys have any thoughts on what's been said so far? Do we in agreeance, disagreeance here?
Yeah, I'll hop in real quick, and just because we missed it during the introduction too, Keegan McClellan, co-founder at Start9, is also on this call and is definitely more qualified than myself to speak to Bitcoin and Bitcoin ecosystem scaling specifically, I tend to operate at a slightly broader, higher scope. And so, look, a lot has been said on this call. And to be honest, I'm not even sure what a lot of it was, okay? That was an uncontextualized, unscoped, deep dive across multiple verticals very quickly. And so I think this call could benefit a little bit from some context, scoping, defining of terms, and then maybe some focused discussion. Okay, that ranged all the way from what is scaling to how is RSK a sidechain, without any real kind of context or defining of terms. So I think it's suffering because of that. I think a lot of the people on this call listening don't know exactly who's saying what or where anyone stands right now. So what I would like to do, from my own point of view here, because it's what, I am setting out to do with Start9, is define scaling real quick, okay? So scaling for me, what I am trying to do, what I am trying to scale in this world is freedom, okay? That is the thing which we are, and I think should be, trying to scale. The question is, to what extent does Bitcoin facilitate the scaling of freedom on Earth? And to what extent does Bitcoin itself, right? And again, we can scope even what that means. To what extent does Bitcoin itself need to scale to contribute to the scaling of freedom? And so you have this broad idea of scaling of freedom. Then you have this, okay, Bitcoin proper, as in on-chain, running a node, the blockchain scaling, right? And we had the scaling debate over many years. And then you have this idea of, well, can Bitcoin scale through sort of secondary effects, right? Can you build things in this world that depend on Bitcoin, that use Bitcoin, but that are not Bitcoin in order to enable further scaling of freedom? And so there's really these three conversations, okay? It's how do we scale freedom, which involves all the ancillary technologies, education, language, everything that scales freedom. Then you have Bitcoin scaling, and then you have Bitcoin ecosystem scaling. And so I tend to focus most broadly on how to scale freedom in this world. And so then the goal is to scale sort of free market, money and principles, and then is to scale Bitcoin insofar as Bitcoin can help free market and free money and free market can help freedom. So I sort of take an outside-in approach to this. And so I think that you only need to scale something insofar as it contributes to its purpose. Okay, so this idea of like approaching this problem from the perspective of how do we scale Bitcoin is actually missing the point, okay? Because you could scale Bitcoin and miss freedom, okay? Unless you literally view those as one and the same thing, which I do not. I believe that there is a whole world here and that Bitcoin is a part of a broader world. And so it needs to scale itself only so much as it enables ancillary and supportive technologies to scale, and then those need to scale insofar as they help the individual be free. So I don't know exactly where to go from there, but I think it's important to keep the conversation contextualized in that manner, because otherwise we can fight all day about scaling Bitcoin and kind of miss the purpose of why we're trying to scale Bitcoin.
Sure. I think I can map what you're saying very easily into my argument, and it's pretty much the same as my argument until the last parts. So first of all, like what is freedom, right? Like we have to define things. You're trying to define scale and what you want to scale, although that's not a definition of scale. It's just saying what you want to scale, and that's fine. We started with the definition of scaling, and then we did talk about the topic of, let's be clear about what you want to scale here, whether you want to scale Bitcoin or something else. And so you want to make the argument that you want to scale freedom. And I'll say, okay, well, what is freedom? We have to define that too. And freedom to most people generally is like your rights, like the things that you're allowed to do that, as long as you're not, impeding on others, this gets into like nonviolence and voluntarism, et cetera. But generally freedom is your ability to exercise your rights. Okay, what are rights? Rights, rights are things that are enforced. They're things that literally only you can enforce your own rights. The only rights you have are the rights that you can enforce. And so this is why Bitcoin enables freedom, right? Because you can run the node and you can enforce the rules. And so you can enforce your rights to run Bitcoin. You literally define Bitcoin locally and you do it mutually with other people. And so in order to have freedom and include the concept of Bitcoin or a store of value, which is why we're all here to talk. So let's at least keep that context included. In order to scale Bitcoin, to scale freedom, and to have Bitcoin be part of this plan, you have to actually not give up your ability to enforce your rights. And so, for an example, you take your Bitcoin and you move it to the Lightning Network. At no moment do you lose your rights to that Bitcoin. You always hold your keys, and you always have the ability to settle that payment in a fair way. You can't settle that payment in a way that steals, and so thus all rights are enforceable by the user. They remain this way, and you can go back to Bitcoin while enforcing your rights. But if you
Not totally true.
Well, let me finish the last part, and then you can include that. And then if you want to say move to Liquid Network, and I'll use Liquid Network because I know a little bit more about it than RSK, but I could easily change the parallels if we get into the details. But when you move to Liquid Network, you basically give up your custody. You give up your keys and you send your Bitcoin to some other network, some other person, some other entity, and you receive a different asset in return. And that network's behavior and that network's protocol is to give you a fair trade for that asset for Bitcoin when you want to leave. But it is a permission process from a federated network. And so as a sidechain, it is mostly just a separate network that accepts Bitcoin as a payment method for entry. And so you have to give up your rights. You have to give up your freedom in order to use that network. And then that network comes with a whole new set of trade-offs where, it may be more censorable, it may be, less secure, et cetera, and more centralized in general. And so now you have given up your degree of freedom as well. And so if we're talking about scaling freedom here, a side chain, of any design resembling this at all is not a scaling of freedom. It is a reduction of freedom compared to Bitcoin.
I want to step in here real quick and comment, though, that while the only rights that you have are those that you can enforce, we engage in behavior all of the time where we voluntarily give up certain rights to reach mutual agreements with people that we want to coordinate with.
Trust.
And so, yes, it's
no, it's right.
It's both mutual. It's both trust in your counterparties as well as trust in the enforcement mechanism, even if you do not have sovereign access to executing the enforcement mechanism. So if I create a private, contract with a counterparty, there is some level of trust. How much trust is really defined by how specific and how draconian the parameters of your contract are, but you're also then trusting the court system to be executed in proper. And so the parallels here are that, yes, you might not necessarily, there are obviously different trust properties between sidechains and main chain. There are also obviously different trust properties between Lightning and main chain Bitcoin, right? Like there's the entire punishment scheme as it works today is such that, you have the opportunity to enforce your rights, but if you drop the ball, so to speak, that you may end up getting cheated by counterparties. It's unlikely, but it's possible. And so the idea that any of this is kind of this black and white.
Too. It's true of all protocols.
Right.
You can change while you're gone.
I think it's slightly different than what I'm saying in this particular case. That, yes, like obviously if you're not participating in a protocol, then the odds that you are in any way able to influence it are near zero. But there's a difference between influencing the rules of the protocol themselves and executing state, which is really what is happening during a transaction on the Lightning Network. It's what's happening in a transaction on the base layer.
When you are enforcing the Bitcoin protocol with your node, you're literally checking the state and you're checking your UTXOs within that state to make sure the rules have been followed as you define them locally and that the Bitcoins and the UTXOs that you own are still owned by you. And so you're enforcing the state just the same.
So can I jump in real quick too and say something, which is, I'm not sure what your point is, John. So I hear you and I actually agree with everything that you're saying, But I actually don't think that there's a disagreement in at least what you've said in the last 5 minutes, which is that scaling involves trade-offs, right? That there are sort of not sacrifices, but costs associated with getting what you want in this world, right? So you want more transactions per second or something. You want to scale Bitcoin transactions to more users. Well, the fact of the matter is that that's not a wand. You can't just like say, well, in other words, I feel like you could point to almost everything and be like, that's not perfect. That's
no,
perfect.
I'm not trying
perfect.
to be so abstract to be meaningless. I'm trying to be very literal and basically show the actual flow and dynamics of these things and how they interact, to show that there are some things that are being purported to be on Bitcoin and scaling Bitcoin that actually are not scaling Bitcoin. They're competing with Bitcoin. And I don't, whether competing with Bitcoin is evil or good or useful, it would be a separate topic, so much as that if we want to talk about Bitcoin scaling, then that's talking about things in the way that I'm describing them. And if we want to talk about scaling exposure to blockchains, that's a different conversation.
Sure, and that's why I talked about the scoping of the conversation, right? Because if we're talking about scaling Bitcoin, like, and you define scaling Bitcoin as Bitcoin proper, then we shouldn't even introduce Lightning or any sidechains into the conversation. It's actually
no, we can't, because Lightning
from the conversation.
Lightning is a network where they all use Bitcoin. It literally is Bitcoin transactions.
John, let me try to see if I can. True. Let me try to clarify your argument, because I think that you're saying something that is, I think it's true, but it's not coming through properly, which is that the reason that you're defining Lightning as to be part of Bitcoin proper is that if at any moment you decide that you want enforcement at layer 1, that there's no point in the protocol which you cannot do that. Is that right?
Well, that, and it's literally Bitcoin transactions.
Well, but that's somewhat irrelevant, because if I structure all of my transactions on a sidechain to be identical to Bitcoin transactions, right? The fact that they are or are not Bitcoin transactions only matters insofar as at any point in your agreement or in whatever other layer. It only matters
insofar as your first point. It's the only
right.
thing
You have to be able to check
in order for you to settle them.
Exactly.
At any
you
moment.
have to be able to checkpoint it into layer 1 at any point if you so choose. That's the property you're after.
And that's fine. And that's fine if that's how we want to define Bitcoin. Okay? I'm just saying that.
I'm after atomicity and determinism, so that way we can know that we're not giving up our freedoms, that we can actually have the ability to enforce our ownership of our Bitcoin and the rules under which they're used.
So I want to point out that on the one hand, Lightning actually doesn't have that property. There are conditions under which you can't there are conditions under which you couldn't get your settlement transaction confirmed on chain, and you could effectively be double spent. There's an attack that's known on Lightning called the flood and loot attack, where basically a node that has a lot of channels open will force close all of the channels at the same time, and the counterparties won't be able to confirm the penalty transaction in time because the network is too congested. Another condition might be that the channel is not economical to submit a penalty transaction, because maybe the balance that is owed on the channel is less than the market rate for fees. So there are conditions in which Lightning can't be settled on chain. And then on the other hand, there are sidechain designs in which you can always get your coins back out of the sidechain permissionlessly. Zendu is one such protocol, which uses zero knowledge proofs. Things aren't so concretely one way or the other. Lightning isn't a perfectly enforceable layer 2 protocol with the same trust properties as layer 1. And on the other hand, there are sidechain designs that are stronger, much stronger, almost identical to layer 1 security properties and settlement guarantees. that could be implemented on Bitcoin.
But you're leaving off that there's no mining on the side chain. And so they have the whole risk of whatever they've replaced mining with. And even if it's merge mining, you're running the risk of it no longer being merged mined. In other words, it doesn't have the same hash power as Bitcoin. So you're always going to have risk of, some form of congestion or some form of unavailability or whatever it may be that is going to be just as much in proportion as what you're saying about Lightning Network. And so
but
you made 3
you
points.
have those in Lightning too, right? Like
Right.
if your counterparty's down, like if your channel parties are down, you can't spend.
But you can
Full
settle.
stop. You can settle, yes. You're not incurring custodial risk.
If I could just jump in really quick here, and I think that Matt made a really good distinction of talking about scaling freedom as the ultimate goal. As a Bitcoiner, and I try to think as open-mindedly about how Bitcoin is going to maneuver into the future. I 100% can understand a lot of John's kind of points around what does it actually mean to scale Bitcoin, given the trustless nature and security of actually having Bitcoin on chain. But I just can't help but think of in practice in the real world, I just see this entire space of scaling Bitcoin as well as where it intersects with trust as being a massive grid, and many people finding many different solutions along that grid. So I get it. I think that how will Bitcoin ultimately scale into the future, on this foundation that is trustless, that is the ultimate goal. But I just can't help but imagine that the idea of scaling this monetary revolution is going to happen along a massive spectrum, and I just don't see how that's not actually scaling Bitcoin. Also, I need a bounce, so you can call that my last word.
I think that was a great point, CK, and thanks for joining. We can even look at how these protocols we've been talking about today have been used, whether we're talking about main chain Bitcoin or Lightning. Let's say or self-custodial, control of Bitcoin is kind of the bare minimum standard. With self-custodial wallets, most self-custodial wallet users are probably just connecting to a third-party node and not doing their own verification. With Lightning wallets, most self-custodial Lightning wallets users are probably relying on a third-party watchtower, and so even within these protocols that have the potential to be maximally trust minimized, we can see that there's a spectrum of trust minimization or all the way to fully trusted third parties, and users are picking and choosing the combinations that they want.
It's also multidimensional
for these different protocols.
That I think I think what people spend the most time talking about is custodial trust, and that's the thing that we've kind of all been inoculated as Bitcoiners to be very skeptical of. But there are other points of trust in any of these systems, because for example, if you use something like Breeze Wallet or you use something like Phoenix Wallet on the Lightning Network today, ostensibly there is no custodial risk in the sense that you can close your channel and recover your funds to L1 at any time, but because your only channel party is either Breeze or Async respectively, then they do have certain, at least in terms of over certain timeframes, they have censorship ability over you. Or in the case of Phoenix, where you delegate all of the route finding to them, you leak privacy to them. So it's not just there's not just one aspect of trust here. And so whether or not you in your life view custodial risk to be your biggest problem, or privacy risk to be your biggest problem, or availability risk to be your biggest problem, you're going to make different choices. And I don't expect that we're going to get to the end of this whole process of building up Bitcoin and not expect people to have different valuations of each of their risks that are tightly tailored to whatever they're experiencing in their own lives, right? Because at the end of the day, money is a risk management tool. And so if people are going to have different risks, they're going to have different preferences as far as which trade-offs they're going to make.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like we're moving the goalposts a bit because if the topic is scaling, that's one thing, Bitcoin scaling, et cetera, freedom scaling, whatever it may be. But if the topic is what are the trade-offs of implementations of various, options for Bitcoiners, then then we can talk about that. I would say that, there's a whole spectrum of ways that people implement Lightning, and some are, more self-sovereign than others. But that is not necessarily saying none of those topics are going to be arguing whether or not Lightning is scaling. It's just whether or not which option requires more trade-offs than another, and which trade-offs suit you. I certainly can't argue that custody is useless. I am trying to get tokens on the Lightning network. I have no problem with trusted situations when they have appropriate utility and they're clearly defined. But what I don't want is to confuse people to end up in situations where they're making a trade-off and they don't realize it, and they're not actually using Bitcoin when they're being told they use Bitcoin. And this is a reason why we don't support like liquid tokens in our products, for example. I love Blockstream. I trust Blockstream, but I don't know a way that I can honestly communicate within a mobile app UI what exactly the trade-offs are when I'm telling them to use liquid tokens. Like if I make these tokens out of Bitcoin transactions, then I don't really have to tell them that much. But if I put them on a federated permission network, a private network, et cetera, there's a bunch of things that you just can't really communicate very easily. And so I don't think that that's using Bitcoin. I don't want to throw customers into that and tell them that they're using Bitcoin.
Sure. So I think we all have sympathy for the idea that we would love to ideally not have to make any sacrifices in terms of how we use Bitcoin ever. But we also, I think, all agree that every single scaling methodology that we've discussed, everything from ZK proofs to sidechains to Lightning Network to increasing the block size, comes with a set of trade-offs. And so when we're discussing scaling, we are inevitably discussing a question of trade-offs. And one of those trade-offs, which I think, John, you pointed out well, is the question of can people understand those trade-offs and how are people actually going to use those trade-offs? So, for example, with Lightning Network, the vast majority of people who are using Lightning Network are pretty deep into Bitcoin. But the majority of them are also using custodial wallets. So in some ways, we've taken a step back with Lightning. Not in the theoretical sense, but in the practical sense because of the different trade-offs that the technology introduces or involves. And so what this suggests to me is that for various use cases, various different users, and various different circumstances, you're actually going to have different trade-offs that are going to be optimal when it comes to scaling. And as a result, we probably need more than one type of Bitcoin layer 2, more than one kind of scaling solution. And we're going to need different strategies for different circumstances. I don't think that we've seen anything technologically feasible which is going to allow us to scale without trade-offs. And, there's a bunch of things that we can't do with Lightning. We can't really do smart contracts with Lightning. We can't do pooled assets with Lightning, which are very, very useful for things like trading, for things like lending. And if we want to get rid of middlemen, right, then that's a particular thing that we're trying to accomplish. Then that requires and is going to require technologies in addition to Lightning Network. So I don't think anyone here is against Lightning Network. I think we're all massive Lightning Network fans. Otherwise, we wouldn't know enough about it to speak intelligently about it. But I think what we're suggesting is that we need to look beyond Lightning if we want to be able to accomplish all of the freedom scaling, Bitcoin ecosystem scaling, and Bitcoin scaling that we want to achieve.
I have no issue with looking beyond Lightning. I'm not trying to say that Lightning has solved all the problems. Matter of fact, it bothers me when people say we solved scaling with the Lightning Network, because we didn't. We solved maybe for a while scaling of high-frequency transactions, and that's one aspect of how people use Bitcoin. And there are still other, we have to scale users. We have to scale other aspects of Bitcoin as well. But what I'm trying to say is that, and what I truly honestly believe, is that if we accept the limitations of Bitcoin, the rules of Bitcoin, and try to design with those limitations, you will actually find that there are still things to invent. There are still technologies, maybe different types of layers that actually allow people to keep their custody of their Bitcoin that can be designed. And I think that by distracting ourselves with, low-hanging fruit kind of mimicry solutions, like adding a blockchain on top of a blockchain, these are ideas that people had a long time ago, and they just kind of stuck with them and used them. I think that those actually distract people from designing within actual Bitcoin limitations and distract people from inventing things like the Lightning Network and creating solutions that are compatible with Bitcoin. And I think like we will find with shitcoins, many of the use cases that these things claim either don't actually need to happen on Bitcoin anyway, or they can happen within Bitcoin if we design for them intentionally. And so I just think that, like, for example, we don't have to do like identity, you don't have to put this on chain necessarily. You can do it without a blockchain entirely. But, to do high frequency Bitcoin transactions, you do. And so, I think we need to identify the use cases, identify where these use cases belong, whether they belong in Bitcoin or not, and whether or not they're just always going to be trusted, and be honest about that. And if they are going to be trusted, we have to ask ourselves whether we need a blockchain at all, whether we need a federation at all, et cetera, because there's always an optimal kind of lowest friction way to design each use case. And I think that you would find, at least some people would find, that they could design within the Bitcoin space and invent things like Lightning that don't require trust in order to use Bitcoin.
So the one thing about that I'm not sure is the right approach is that if you're always working backwards from specific use cases and only designing around those things, then there are periods of innovation, specifically with regards to like the personal computing revolution and the internet itself, where rather than having like a specific thing you were trying to set out to do, someone basically built a general tool. And I'm very sympathetic to all of the arguments that general tools can come with risks that we don't properly understand, and I'm very receptive to those arguments. But to say that that building general tools is valueless because you can't name the use case immediately, it's just not historically well supported. And so, I will be the first to tell you that like the EVM is broken 8 ways from Sunday, but like I think that there are times when there's like a missing aspect of, like, imagine trying to do arithmetic without the number 0, right? Someone might be like, well, you can always design some scheme for doing this arithmetic without 0. But putting 0 into your algebra just cleans the whole thing up, right? It makes you have to make a lot less weird, hack, ugly compromises in order to get there. And so, yes, consensus malleability is itself a risk, but there are things in those layers that sometimes you need to do in order to clean things up, and you end up getting a lot better results at the end.
I do think, I disagree with the concept of you saying that you don't think use cases should be designed from the use case first. I think that's a big mistake that people tend to make in our industry, is they don't look at the use case first. They look at, I have a hammer and let me find some things that look like nails. Or I noticed that there are nails around. Let me make a tool and see if we can use it as a hammer. And so the problems that we have here is you end up with things, for example, like I want to talk about NFTs on one side, and then I want to talk about how the concept of that all scaling is like adding resource overhead. And so if you add some sort of like multi-purpose tool that you don't really have a use case specifically in mind for, then now you're adding a cost to the network and an overhead, and that scale might not get realized. And so you could be wrong. And so if you don't have a use case in mind from the start, you're taking a huge risk. You're just saying, I want to add risk and I want to add overhead, and I want to cross my fingers and hope that people actually care about the maybe use cases I've kind of thought of. That's one problem. And then on the flip side, you have the problem that is what's happening with NFTs right now. Like NFTs, they're design is horrible. As far as NFTs, like for art, for example, you can't have millions and millions of unique items on a blockchain and expect that to scale. You know, it's just going to blow up the blockchain. It's going to blow up the size, blow up the overhead, and eventually these items will be worth less than the cost to transfer them. I could design an NFT credentialing system right now that did not require a blockchain at all and would fully scale. But that's not sexy, right? Like, I can't pretend like we invented some sort of magic. And so instead what happens is somebody invents something in the short term that takes off, and a lot of people are captivated by the fact that it's taking off, and they make the assumption that the design is sound. And so we end up, having to undo and fix this mess after. And it is a huge, costly mess, in my opinion. And so I think from both directions, you have to be very careful to actually respect the use case and respect the design from the use case standpoint.
Certainly. I'm not sitting here saying that no one should ever think about use cases. But one of the things that your description misses is that there's like, if I have like 10 different use cases, right? And I am like, okay, this is the end user use case we're trying to solve, 1 through 10. And I design something that specifically fits each one of those use cases, right? And maybe there's costs added in the process of to solving for those use cases. You know for sure that those are real use cases because people are clamoring for them, right? But what if instead you had been able to design a general tool that solved for 7 of those use cases at once, right?
So,
or what if you don't know what the use cases, or you don't know how the relative valuations people place on various use cases because they don't even have the opportunity to try them out?
I think this might be a good segue, right, to extract ourselves a little bit from the low-level discussion of the technical means that we're trying to accomplish these various things and actually talk about the use cases. It might be worthwhile for us to mention some of the use cases that are important to us, and also this might be a good opportunity to allow some other people who are listening to mention some of the use cases that are important to them, and we can discuss those.
I just like to quickly answer one more time, because there is an abstracted answer that is easy and appropriate to what you said, which is I think you skipped a part. In order to properly design, even if for a specific use case, you should be reducing the design to its primitives. And what you will find is once you've reduced the design to its primitives and you've created an optimal design of some sort, you will find that now that primitive opens up other use cases. And then you have that kind of multi-use case capability. And so I think part of good design, especially for protocols and networks and systems, is being skilled at reducing the use case design, what you're designing for, reducing its design to primitives, so then you can say, oh, look, what else can we do with these primitives and what other use cases can we perform and problems can we solve?
Right. However, there's usually, so maybe this is baked into what you were talking about what the notion of optimal design is. But very, very often when you are designing to solve a problem, there are multiple, what I would describe as like factorizations that you can do. You can say like, let's bust it up into this set of primitives, or maybe I'm going to try to bust it up into a completely different set of primitives. And that sometimes you'll notice that if you're trying to aggregate a number of use cases, that one set of primitives looks cleaner in isolation. Like, I'm trying to do this thing and it only has 2 steps if we do it this way, but it has 3 steps if we do it this other way. But if you do it the 3-step way and you use those primitives, then you can sometimes enable use cases beyond what you were originally setting out to solve that the 2-step way does not necessarily. And so it's not necessarily the case that you can what I would describe as like greedily solve this problem, where you're just looking at one use case, try to find the optimal design and then try to reuse a primitive next. Sometimes you need to be able to zoom out a little bit. And try to solve the larger problem, and then make sure that it still satisfies the individual use case from which it was inspired.
Yeah, just one sec here. While we're going about use cases, etc., please, guys, submit a request to speak if you'd like to ask any questions for our guests here. We've had a lot of requests so far, but let's submit them and we will approve you when we get a moment. Go on, John, sorry.
I was gonna say, I think we're maybe getting a little bit in the weeds on protocol and system design for the audience, but generally I would agree with that last statement and say that this is what we see happening, for example, with standards. We see like, okay, let's invent a standard, and there's the whole, comic joke where it's like, we have too many standards, let's make a new standard. And I actually believe that that's the way to do it properly. In other words, you will invent a set of things, and you will notice, hey, we can compile this set of things in a much more efficient way, and you make a new set of things. And this is like in my opinion, like the nice way to evolutionarily design things from primitives and solve use cases.
So, for me, one of the key use cases that I'm interested in is being able to use my Bitcoin in various ways. I would like to be able to never have to sell my Bitcoin, so I'd like to be able to borrow against my Bitcoin, but I don't want to go through middlemen. Ideally, I would like to be able to increase the amount of Bitcoin I have, but I basically have no fiat with which to buy more Bitcoin because I'm all in Bitcoin, so I would love to be able to earn Bitcoin either by lending or as I'm doing right now. I actually have a smaller, a part of my Bitcoin levered up moderate amount because that way I know I'm never going to be liquidated. So these are some of the use cases that are important to me. Bitcoin-backed stablecoins are very important to me because I think that's the way that we can create uncensorable on-ramps and off-ramps instead of having to use fiat and fiat IOUs. I'd be interested to hear what some of the other use cases that people find important for them.
I mean, yes, I can go next. I really want to be able to just have every financial service that is currently available in the fiat world available essentially on my laptop, not at the behest of another party, right? Like I want to be able to trade various assets. Like I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist in the sense that I only own Bitcoin. I still think that equities and debts and derivatives play their role in people's portfolios depending on what your worldview is. And so I want to be able to trade those things around, to be able to manage those things in a way that I'm not having to trust an individual brokerage not to cut me off when I want. Now, obviously, maybe any of my trading counterparties might decide to stop doing business with me at any given point in time. But the idea is that they cannot also hold my assets hostage at the same time. That's like what I'm most interested in.
Okay, we have a person on FutureBit. Would you like to ask a question for the panels? Anything on use cases? Go ahead. You have the floor.
Good evening, everybody. I think it's morning there in the States, but yeah, where I am, it's late in the evening. In any event, the question is...
Sounds like you're in South Africa.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sounds like you're in South Africa.
That's right. Old Andre Cronje's neighborhood. Yeah, so been in the Bitcoin ecosystem for the last maybe 8-9 years, and the first stumble block that I encountered was trading Bitcoin for anything other than Bitcoin and to and from. So I've recently discovered Thorchain, which is sort of not which is a permissionless type DEX environment, but very technical to navigate. So I think from a common person, it's not technical, it's just a pure user. I think we just want things to be a little bit more easy going, simplistic as far as design's concerned, and I think the accessibility of trading other commodities or currencies or even labor, for that matter, to and from some form of a Bitcoin DEX, preferably a DEX that is permissionless, because I mean we can do that with centralized exchanges, but to stay off the radar, you need it to be permissionless and open. So all these other things that's built on to Bitcoin at the moment, like Lightning, yes, it facilitates a small transaction quicker and so forth, but I don't think people keep Bitcoin as a cash payment system currently, as there's too many other better competitors. So to achieve what you guys are discussing here, I think the user becomes creative and gets a workaround for most of the problems they encounter. Like myself, I find ways to trade different things, and eventually it ends up in Bitcoin because that's what I save in. So I think it's more tunneling towards your war chest of Bitcoin and back to your functional assets like money or so that's the things that I think the general user out there needs more than the stress of setting up things to make things actually work. So yeah, I think that's more or less what we are asking for. So yeah, anybody can tell me whether we eventually will get there where we've got Bitcoin as the reserve currency that we all deal with on large volumes, and I think then even small community type chain projects to facilitate the small payments with a open DEX to get back to your Bitcoin, and then just liquidate portions of your Bitcoin to use as a utility. I don't know if I just think it's almost as if Lightning is an overworked situation that gives the user more problems than what it actually solves.
Sure, thank you, Bitter. Let's get some thoughts on that. Did you have something to say there?
I would agree that usability is really important, especially for more mainstream, less technical users. A lot of the tools that are being built are they're the people building them are software developers, so they're more technical by nature. And they might be the first users of the tools, and so the tools kind of end up being built by software developers for software developers. But I think as the inevitable, or I shouldn't say inevitable, but as the kind of incentive for user adoption and growth pushes these products to become more usable in order to be attractive to a wider audience. We're naturally going to see Bitcoin and Bitcoin-related products kind of cross that chasm from early adopters to early majority and people who are used to a more streamlined experience. I think one of the biggest frictions that's going to be very hard for Bitcoin apps to get around is the friction of dealing with the fiat banking system. So if you want to integrate Bitcoin into people's everyday lives, most merchants and other places where people spend their money still only accept fiat, and so Bitcoin wallets and other kinds of Bitcoin applications are having to integrate these kludges that provide a bridge between Bitcoin and the fiat world, which introduce a lot of friction, whether those frictions are cost or whether it's bureaucracy, because you have to fill out forms and do KYC and wait 3 days to get your money and all these other things. It's quite the pain. But I think what a lot of the DEXs and Lightning and the other protocols that are getting built on Bitcoin are doing, or is basically, once you're in Bitcoin, then you can have this very like seamless experience of transacting in a Bitcoin native economy, swapping for other assets instantly, non-custodially, and we start to see a glimpse of the kind of future that we're all, trying to build towards. But as long as we have this kind of reliance of going back to fiat, whether that's the banking system or physical cash, I think we're always going to, users are always going to run into friction at those points. And so, I would be interested in seeing, some innovation in that space to make, fiat, the fiat bridges less painful to use.
So I think, one of the interesting things that we recently saw was Jack Dorsey support a project called TBD, which is primarily around creating a more decentralized network of on-ramps and off-ramps, which would allow people to choose between a large number of different vendors who are trying to attract them. And some of those maybe require KYC, and others maybe are less convenient or more expensive, or maybe just, different and don't require KYC. And I think that's a big part of the solution. We had local Bitcoins that eventually started to have KYC, but efforts like that are super important for the on-ramps and off-ramps. And then in terms of having a DEX, one of the first things that was built by devs who were working on Sovryn was a decentralized exchange, which allows people to use Bitcoin as, Bitcoin is the reserve asset. Everything is measured in sats, and people can trade in and out on that asset. And recently, other devs built a way to do that directly from a Lightning Network. So you can trade directly, basically swap assets directly from Lightning Network using the Sovryn DEX. And I think one of the best things about that in both cases is the user interface is very, very simple. And especially if you have a hardware wallet, you can just plug your hardware wallet in and start using it without any intermediaries. And so I think that's the beauty of using the different pieces that many, many devs are building and rolling them together. I think we get a more cohesive, easier to use system, which more users can use.
Yeah, compared to managing my money in TradFi, Bitcoin is a walk in the park. I mean, I don't even have a 401k. I used to when I for a previous company that I worked for, but I loathe to even log into that account and look at it because I have no idea what to do with it. Whereas with Bitcoin, it's like, okay, I open my wallet and I can transfer it to another address. I can connect my wallet to a dApp and use these different dApps, and it's pretty straightforward. Whereas with TradFi, there's lock-in everywhere you go, and there's a lot of friction in moving money between different accounts and companies. And I think that's partially intentional, but partially just a side effect of the legacy design of the fiat system.
Guys, if I can just jump in here again. Don't get me wrong, I'm pleasantly impressed with what has been achieved up until this point, with all the development that's happened in the last 8 years that I've been looking at the industry. And I think if you are 100% committed to Bitcoin and you are not in the fiat or traditional finance environment anymore, it is easy. It's user-friendly in most cases, I would say. But I agree with the guy that said when you encounter the fiat system, there's friction, and KYC, AML, all these things just add to that friction. And I think the right idea is to go the route that Jack Dorsey is busy looking at, on-ramp, off-ramp focused development to get a decentralized, something like local Bitcoins like it used to be in the beginning. But you can't use that anymore because of KYC and all that. So things similar to that could facilitate actual hard cash transfer between peers into Bitcoin. But I think it should be a one-way trade. Shouldn't go back to fiat. That's just personal opinion. But yeah, I think we've come a long way. So any dev out there, do take note. The public is impressed.
Very good. Future bit. I could listen to your accent all day. Did you want to add something, John?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a couple concepts here to kind of separate the ideas into things that people might be able to work with to achieve things that resemble what FutureBit was talking about and what the rest of you were talking about. And one of them is to understand that, like, I think we should be careful with trying to replicate the finance system that we know and that we're used to within Bitcoin, or bring Bitcoin more into the legacy financial system in general, because what we're trying to design for, at least ideally, is that we're trying to eliminate the value of inflationary fiat. And so much of the finance that we talk about, particularly in regards to trading and things that exchanges are used for on a kind of high-frequency basis, is just the arbitrage of the inefficiencies related to inflation and the Cantillon effects related to inflation and the hedging and other interest and percentage aspects of inflation. And so that kind of stuff we shouldn't be designing for or burying Bitcoin into, because we're trying to design ourselves out of that system. And then, with DEXs and the concepts of trade, like, I am more interested personally in the concept of trade in the abstract, like bartering, matching people with the things they're actually trying to achieve in their business, doings. And so that might be, making sure I can buy supplies from the right person or find the right customers, or even to borrow money to be able to grow my business more quickly. And so all of these things require different amounts of trust and different amounts of financial situations that aren't very related to, say, a DEX use case. At least not unless you make that a DEX in the abstract, where we're like, trading futures of corn and, doing things that actually have to do with production and with services provided by humans. And so I personally am a lot less interested in DEX in the concept of trade. In other words, like Bitcoin for Ethereum or Bitcoin for dollars, or basically monies for monies, because that's the old system. That's not supposed to be. We're not supposed to keep printing more and more monies, because we just keep continually repeating this inefficiency that we're trying to design away with Bitcoin. And so speculating on trades, you're never going to be able to do that in a high-frequency, low-latency way with anything that is actually a DEX. And so a DEX is ultimately going to be, a true DEX is going to be some way of locally assembling, offers and bids for the assets. And then you'll just have to hope you can match with the amount of latency that's available. And the more you want to lower the latency, the more trust and more privacy you're going to have to give up. And so I am more interested in what we're doing, say, for example, with slash tags and our whole atomic economy ecosystem kind of concept, is I'm trying to find ways to actually abstract products and services into the Bitcoin blockchain and this whole economy, and find ways to actually measure trust and give people the capability to communicate their reputation and establish these things in the abstract and in their own personal ways through webs of trust concepts. And to me, that is, at least, for what we're doing and how I see the Bitcoin ideals, I think this is more appropriate, because we're not trying to do a DEX in the sense of assembling an order book of a bunch of people for one pair. We're trying to do a DEX in the concept of, we're trying to create this like fractal environment where we're matching people both proximally and economically appropriately.
I go even further. I don't think that a central order book is a coherent idea if you're truly talking about a decentralized exchange.
Right. You have to host it. Like the DEX always has to be hosted somewhere. It's either hosted by you and therefore not trusted and extremely high latency, and or it's hosted by someone else. And now you have trust and privacy issues.
Okay, gentlemen. So I had our Naza on here who wanted to ask a question. You're free to speak. Just unmute yourself. Our Naza.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that if we are going to do a decentralized exchange, it's going to be more like local bitcoins or stuff like that, where you're basically pairing people in a local environment who want to trade in a certain way. And the trick here is to not make an order book, but to have some sort of verifiable credentials for people to transfer trusts from trades to future trades. So what we are trying to do is basically just pair identity with verifiable credentials to build this application, which is OTC kind of exchange, but also to build any other web of trust reliant application. So that's what I wanted to say.
Do you have a question to add to that? Thank you for your support, though.
Nothing else to add, Dar?
No, that's fine.
Yeah, generally, I think that R is saying something similar, and I definitely agree with what he's saying, that, to assemble things locally is how you would do decentralized things, local first. And so you have to be able to enforce the rules locally, and thus you have to assemble everything locally. And that's never going to be an efficient thing, with something like trading, basically.
Okay, thank you very much, R. Satoshi, please go ahead and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I see that there are a lot of experts here today, and I just want to express myself on recent times. We've seen recent revolution that we are all witnessing on mass adoption. Basically, I just want to know on scalability. So is it better to use Sovryn or instead of buying Bitcoin, or is it better to buy investing in stocks, for example? Or for example, for me, freedom is to choose the project that I want. In this case, I like to put my money on subs. I better buy Bitcoin. They just announced that RBTCs now can be exchanged automatically or something. There's two ways now you can do it easier. So to me, that's a way of freedom. Is free will. You can choose whatever you want to invest. I'd rather put basically. What would you say where I can acquire the node, Bitcoin node sculpture node? Is there a place that I can buy one? So, and my main question today is, what do you all guys think? Is mass adoption something that is going to be happening in the United States, like as a legal tender for Bitcoin? I don't know. There's some of the things I have questions on. I'm trying to put my little grain of salt by setting up my own Bitcoin node. I'm still working on it. I also started doing my Roth RIA with a company called Choice. They have an app. It's really fun, and that's what I've been doing lately. What do you all guys think? Is this really happening now? Is like, how can I help with the ecosystem to help Bitcoin? Because all of you are experts, and that's why I'm asking you, because you are amazing.
Yeah, so I think on the topic of Bitcoin becoming legal tender in the U.S., I don't see that happening anytime soon. The U.S. politicians seem very defensive of the U.S. dollar's position as a global reserve currency, and I think giving legitimacy to Bitcoin, they see it as threatening that position. So countries like the U.S. I think are going to be the last to adopt it as legal tender. But smaller countries that like El Salvador, which either don't have their own power of seigniorage or just have failing currencies in general, I think have a more of an incentive to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. That's my perspective on that.
Very good. Thank you, Lloyd. Let's get on to Mike A. I know you've been waiting a while. Go ahead.
Oh, no. Thanks for bringing me on. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Cool, yeah. So my name's Mike. I'm a program manager at Intel. Kind of dox myself, I guess, but just wanted to bring my perspective on kind of this whole conversation kind of from that product standpoint. Because if I was looking at this project, kind of going over like all the different aspects of it, honestly, like Bitcoin is already one, like if I was looking at this, I wouldn't be, and I had a budget, I wouldn't be trying to allocate improving the tech. I'd be focusing on like ads and sales, like how do we get this as possible, right? Because yeah, Bitcoin one, it's like used as one of the base layers, so I don't think there's any challenge to that really. Kind of on the to kind of give some feedback to that representative's question. I think like right now, kind of networking and like every single person who mentions Bitcoin on their Twitter account, like for representatives, gets immediately like thousands of followers. Like get every rep, Bitcoin, get them as many followers. You know, that's what the game theory of Bitcoin is. One of the beauties of it. Like we need to get like a Bitcoin wallet for all of these reps. And then my question to everyone was, as far as kind of like the tech layer goes, I heard some pushback on like wrapping Bitcoin, and I wanted to ask why we're not kind of using the OI model, the network model, network protocol. They're not trying to improve TCP/IP. They're trying to make sure that every like transport layer, like HTTP, FTP, TCP/IP, why aren't we trying to like get more rep Bitcoin on every other layer instead of trying to, at some point, TCP/IP and IP realized they couldn't scale and do everything. So why aren't we trying to get kind of adopt that model?
For what it's worth, TCP doesn't really have scalability issues. Like we didn't, unless you're talking about like some of the move to like Quick and stuff like that, where they're dropping the ACK packets, but it's been like 2 or so decades. The reason that some of those higher layers was actually more for about flexibility and standardization of more like increasingly complex use cases.
Mm-hmm. Right, those increasing use cases when we talk about like bartering versus DEXs versus like, I hope one day stocks will be traded, you know, on some type of blockchain. That makes so much sense to me. So all those use cases and flexibility is kind of why I don't think Bitcoin can really do much more and scale much more, because it's already perfect at what it does, and every change is asking to be like, is asking to introduce more bugs, essentially.
I want to comment on 2 aspects to warn you to be careful what you wish for. If the SEC, for example, were to make a blockchain for enforcing trading rules for stocks, and they said the only legal way to trade stocks was on their blockchain, you would be extremely regulated. In other words, the regulation would be automated, and you would have no choice but to comply, and they could change the rules whenever they wanted to. You'd be totally at their whim. There would be a total centralized control. And that to me is something that's very possible and also very scary. And so I would say be careful about, how the design of how you wish for these things, because like what would be more open would be to just say issue equity tokens using Bitcoin as the anchor layer, but that's actually not really legal because of regulation. Most countries require you to issue your equity in certain forms that can be controlled. And this is why even, for example, the equity is issued with Liquid all come with KYC aspects baked in. You can't actually do a securities trade without following regulations, and even when you're using Liquid equity tokens. And so, again, you have to be very careful what you wish for, because the problem with equities in tokens or blockchains is mostly a regulatory one. It's not a technological one. And if you make it a technological one, things will probably just get worse. And I would make the same warning with wanting to solicit and support politicians. It can seem very, very appealing and very awesome to have like miscellaneous, representative or congresswoman or whatever supporting Bitcoin, raising money in Bitcoin and saying good things about Bitcoin. But you have to remember, these are politicians, and they will turn on Bitcoin in a moment if they think it will gain them, additional notoriety, additional capability to move up the ladder in politics. And the only way to move up the ladder in politics is to continually and more deeply support the state, which is basically the antithesis of Bitcoin. And so we have to be very careful with our support and cheering of politicians, because their incentives are not necessarily entirely with Bitcoin.
So what I understand on what you just said, John, is basically all politicians that are pro-Bitcoin are going to be using the power of blockchain technology to pretty much use that in favor of their campaigns and all that, and not to benefit or to actually make the cities better or make sure, everyone gets benefit from that.
This is not necessarily
I'm just
true
saying
if you're
both
a
sides.
minority.
You can have somebody that's all good as well and always doing good for Bitcoin. It's not impossible. I'm just saying the trend, and what we've seen of politicians historically is not very consistent with that ideal.
Well, and also that politicians, as long as they're in the super minority groups, they're free to essentially be their idealistic selves, because that's what's actually promoting their careers. It's really once the rubber hits the road and they actually have the power to affect real positive change, that's when their incentives really start to change, because now they're confronted with actually disempowering the state, which also disempowers themselves.
Okay, we can appreciate the feedback there, gentlemen. Thank you. David Soroy, I've seen you waited a while. Let's get the last question from you, please.
Sure. So I joined late. I hope the call's been going well. John Carvalho, what are your thoughts on some collaboration between Sovryn and Synonym, specifically with potentially bringing Sovryn's Bitcoin-backed stablecoin onto Synonym? And I've generally had this conversation briefly with you in person one time and also over Twitter. And I got two very different results, which I think understandably I see both sides. But I'm curious, has your perspective on any of that changed? I personally see a extremely compelling use case for Bitcoin-backed dollars. And I'm happy to elaborate, but I'll let you kind of riff off that.
So I'll take the diplomatic approach here and give you a clinical, literal answer, which is it is not Synonym that decides whether you issue a token using our tech. Our tech was all going to be fully open sourced. The OmniBolt technology that we're using to do tokens on Lightning is not even created by us. We're just implementing it into our applications and supporting it within our products. And so whether Synonym supports your token is not an actual thing, because we're not issuing any tokens and we're not providing support for any tokens specifically, other than maybe, and I still haven't even cleared this with legal yet, at some point we might add the ability to buy tether channels from our LSP product. But that, again, is a regulated product and it will have limitations to it and these kinds of things, and we have to be careful because tether is obviously a target, and so is Lightning Network in some ways, and so I don't know how that's going to play out. I know I would like to do that, but generally we're a tether company, and so this is already a partnership and extremely integrated with what we're doing. Other than that, though, we're not the gatekeepers of whether a token is issued on Bitcoin or put onto the Lightning Network. So in that sense, it's not up to us, and you can do whatever you want. To talk about our previous interactions, I think when we met in person, probably just generally speaking, being in person, I am not as aggressive as I am on Twitter, and I am the way I'm on Twitter for specific reasons that we can get into another time. But I think you also approached me differently then. In person, it was about the concept of utilizing the technology, but in Twitter, it was about the concept of essentially supporting your specific, token design. And I'm averse to any sort of blockchain that has a native token. I'm averse to convincing people to, put their Bitcoin to work, so they say, by putting it into custody or by putting it at risk in some way in order to capture a yield, which is essentially, when it comes to DeFi and things like this, or BlockFi and other forms of, yield. Most of the time, this is just a trade, and there's a risk of liquidation or other loss. And so I'm not a supporter of trading. I don't support people putting their Bitcoin at risk, trusting their Bitcoin with other people. So it's not something that we would end up supporting anyway.
I think that's a totally fair answer, and I sincerely appreciate it and all of our interactions that we've had. I understand where you're coming from, that there's no gatekeepers, and that the Sovryn team could go ahead and just launch it unilaterally. But I do think that there is room for potential collaboration amongst people who have a shared vision, even if we're approaching it from different angles. And so I would just love to see maybe further conversations of how we can come closer together and maybe have mutual benefit. So I'll just leave it with that. And
Well, I say we're always only limited by our own creativity. So if you can think of an appropriate way that matches our design principles to collaborate, then I'm open to it. Unless you're a U.S. entity. We don't do business with U.S. entities.
Absolutely. I think there'll be some stuff to talk about further. So maybe offline or another time or at a conference or something. But I'll step down for now. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, David. Sovryn Badger, if you could get a nice succinct question in there, we have time for that. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. And I'm not sure if this was addressed before, but when we were talking about trade-offs, and how much are we willing to, to separate from Bitcoin layer 1 and the trade-offs that involves, and the whole definition of freedom. I would say that America is so free, it can be overwhelming at times how much freedom we need to give for convenience, and the same goes for Facebook and Google. But I guess the specific question, more directed to John, it's how do you see, for example, El Salvador's dream come true if it were to be like a true Bitcoin-led revolution in finance? How do you see that nation using Bitcoin to increase freedom and wealth, which is sovereignty, from the micro to the macro? And then a second part within that, since we're talking about El Salvador, USDT is also a big trade-off that I think, we also should consider, if that bond is only USDT, and what trade-offs does that mean? That's a completely different conversation in terms of stablecoins and Bitcoin-backed stablecoins. But yeah, I guess that is the question. How would you see your dream vision of El Salvador truly having a Bitcoin-led transformation in its finances from the micro to the macro, and then a bit maybe about the USDT bond and how that's also a trade-off in a way that could adversely impact El Salvador in the long term. Thank you.
Sure. Great question. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer, but I'll do my best. I would say on the micro and macro, or just the general strategy of Bitcoin that El Salvador is taking and may take in the future, I honestly think they're doing much better job than I could have ever expected. When I saw Jack Mallers, announcing the Bitcoin legal tender thing and crying on stage and making all of the Bitcoin men in the world cry with him, it was just I couldn't believe it. It was literally the only legal thing that I ever asked for. We talk about politics a little bit in this call, and we can talk about, regulations and wanting regulatory clarity and all these things. I think they're ridiculous. Wanting to, persuade politicians to support Bitcoin and raise money in Bitcoin and, make Bitcoin bills. I think it's all nonsense. I think it's all a bad idea. But the only thing I ever wanted was shut up or give me legal tender. And then that happened all of a sudden. I couldn't believe it. It actually happened. the correct approach as far as how I understand things and for my ideals. And then, it just started doubling down from there. Like they're buying Bitcoin regularly. They are now trying to figure out ways to, increase the infrastructure of Bitcoin there by offering their wallet and ATMs. And you can make a lot of criticisms about the implementation so far, like on the micro level, I guess you could say, if that's what you meant. But compared to every other country, they're just light years ahead, and you can it's easy to criticize, and I am somebody that certainly knows that. I enjoy criticizing. But I think that criticizing without actually recommending, an alternative that is actually practical is not useful. And so I think that El Salvador so far appears to be doing their best, and that what I'd like to see play out as things progress is more of a focus on non-custodial Bitcoin, on educating people about Bitcoin, why it's important, why it's valuable, what it's good for, why the president is taking the strategy, et cetera. Just more education and more, promotion of self-sovereign ideals so they understand the value of what they're exposed to, and they become even better than forced. A lot of people think they're forcing them to use it as legal tender, which is just not true. Nobody is being forced. It's actually the uptake has been pretty low when you actually go to El Salvador and try to spend Bitcoin. It is not widespread, and nobody is accepting it because they feel like they have to. Many people don't accept it at all. And so I want to see people excited to receive Bitcoin, and I want to see them, excited to understand what it is and excited to hold their own keys, et cetera. And so that's the only difference I would make on a strategic level, and how I hope things evolve a little bit more in the future. I'll make another side note that I am a little worried about how cavalier the president is. It's fun to watch him meme on Twitter and fun to watch him talk about trading on the toilet and talk about buying the dip and things like this. But that approach is promoting trading, and the approach is promoting taking risks without actually weighing the risks. And while that isn't what he's actually doing, he has already predetermined that he would allocate a certain amount of money to buying Bitcoin. So he's just doing what he said he was going to do. But portraying it in these ways creates a culture, and a culture, another aspect of the culture that I don't think is healthy long-term for Bitcoiners and Bitcoin itself. To talk about the risk with the bond and stablecoins, my way of approaching this is, first of all, disclaimer, I don't know that many details about the bond. I don't have anything to do with the design of it or anything like that. My relationship with Tether is not on that level. Tether is a great supporter of what we're doing as a company and our vision, and I try to focus on that. But within our vision, part of our design and why I am trying to promote the concept of doing tokens on the Lightning Network is because I feel like this frees up the ability to basically decentralize Tether and basically allow people to choose, the Tether of their choice from people they actually rely on and trust in their normal day-to-day business. And so taking the concept of let's not just have Tether be the only thing that everybody uses as a stable coin or a stable asset that is a bearer instrument on a blockchain. Let's give them the choice of using issued assets from the people they actually rely on, so they can be a symbiosis there and a synergy there between you and the businesses that you use every day. So in other words, having the businesses that you frequently use issue their own tokens, a gift token, or it could be, like a gift card, but in a token format, it could be denominated in dollars, but it also could be denominated in the actual product or service. And this might be a way in some countries to kind of get around some of the legal problems of issuing dollars or issuing securities or things like this. You can actually issue either gift cards, which have a little bit of regulation, or you can start trying to actually issue your products and services. So you sell a token that is denominated in hamburgers, denominated in bananas, whatever it may be. And this allows a free, open aftermarket and support system for these tokens. And so you're not just putting the whole world on Tether. And so that would be something I'd like to see and kind of help realize for El Salvador at some point, where when we're done building out the technology that supports this type of vision ecosystem, where now we see if there are businesses that want to issue their own trust and issue their own tokens. So this way people don't have to think to themselves, who the hell is Tether? Who the hell is Liquid? Who the hell are these things I never heard of? Why should I trust them? Why don't I just trust the people I actually care about instead?
Okay, thank you very much, John. Is there any other closing thoughts from any of our other speakers here? Keegan, Yago?
I wouldn't be surprised if Texas gives us a surprise here shortly. I don't know how many years it's going to be, but I think Texas is going to be a good player here among with Arizona. I understand what Lightning said, but I still believe that they're going to come. Maybe late to the party, but they will have to. Otherwise, there will be a run over.
Yeah, I'll say, I thought it was a great debate. I had a lot of fun. Thanks for all the guests for joining. And I'm excited to see so many different develops happening in parallel, building around Bitcoin.
As far as closing thoughts, the only thing I would say is to generally caution people against trying to bucket things into two coarse categories. The original debate was kind of slated as a Lightning or like layers versus sidechains, and there are a lot of these things are a lot more similar than you think, and a lot of the things that you think are very similar differ in really important ways. So when we're evaluating these things, I just encourage people to look a little deeper and try to understand what's actually going on, because I think that'll help inform your own understanding. It'll probably give you better creative ideas to solve some of the problems that we have, and it'll help you as a user even.
I wholeheartedly agree with that statement.
Okay, well, we think we can all acknowledge that we are united by Bitcoin at the end of the day, despite any differences around that. So yeah, thank you very much to all of the guests. John Carvalho, who is at Bitcoin Airlog. You can follow him. Also the Biz at the Biz BTC, his podcasts. Matt Hill, who was with us earlier, at _Matt Hill from Start9labs. And also Keegan, thank you very much, from Start9labs. It's at Proof of Keegs. So that's at Proof of Keegs. Eden Yago, thank you very much, early contributor. Sovryn at Eden Yago. John Light, thank you, at Litecoin. That's L-I-G-H-T, not light, as the coin we all know. And we are at Sovryn BTC if you want to give us a follow as well. Thank you very much to everyone who spent the time to join us. It's been a very interesting debate on all accounts. So remember, take care. And remember, stay sovereign.